I found it really quite odd that in the 2016 presidential election, there's been very little talk about K-12 education, even though there are over 50 million people in our society that are affected by the decisions made by policymakers regarding public education. And I think what we've seen, especially in the media in the past couple of years, there has been a massive discussion around issues in education. And I wish that the presidential candidates would address these concerns. And there's been issues around charter schools and standardized testing and teachers unions and pay for performance. There have been documentaries such as Waiting for Superman, The Race to Nowhere, The War on Kids. And so there has been quite a bit of discussion around education, but I argue that some of the discussion has not been as authentic and rich as it could be. What the media and journalists often frame the conversation around education is charter schools versus against charter schools, pay for performance against pay for performance. Are you for standardized testing or are you against standardized testing? And I obviously believe those are important issues and they need to be talked about and debated. But there is a more important issue, I think, that is above all these issues altogether, which is the American education system and the structures and the anti-democratic nature of this system. And I think we have not talked about the teaching and learning practices of American schools. Why is it that 18-year-olds who are about to go to college have to ask permission to use the bathroom, for example? Why is it that corporal punishment is legal in 19 states in this country? Why is it that children have very few freedoms and rights in school? There was a study done by Robert Epstein, a psychologist and another psychologist, who found that school children are put under 2 times as many restrictions as inmates in prison. So they have very few freedoms and autonomy in schools, and nobody's talking about this. Nobody's addressing these concerns on a national scale. And so I think obviously we need to talk about standardized testing in charter schools and the like, but we also need to address the learning and teaching practices of modern schools. And why is it that schools have largely remained the same ever since their inception in the 1850s? So those questions, I think, need to be posed to our policymakers. And I wish people like Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, as well as the Republican candidates. I mean, Donald Trump has talked a little bit about issues around Common Core. But even on the Democratic side, I think there has been an astonishing lack of discussion and an agenda around K-12 education. And I strongly urge the presidential candidates to discuss this issue because you have millions of people who are affected by these decisions. And I think the media has to do a better job in forcing this conversation onto the national stage. Oftentimes, education journalists have very little experience in education or very little experience actually reporting on the schools themselves. Education is just kind of like one of those other beats. And I argue that if you want to become an education journalist, if you want to report on education issues, you just can't go to that beat from the transportation beat or the national security beat. You have to do a lot of research and understanding of the history of public education, the structures that we have in place, policies. You just can't go into this without having a strong idea of how the system was created and the purposes of it. And I find that most education journalists, one of the reasons why there has been such a poor quality of education journalism in the past couple of years and decades is because the education journalists have not had experience in schools talking to students and teachers, and they don't have any idea of the history of the system. So, I mean, one of the things I wanted to show in my book, Schools on Trial, was that I wanted to elevate the voices of the students and the teachers and the parents to show that their perspectives are basically not considered by policymakers, that they need to be part of this conversation, and the most important stakeholders, which are the students and the teachers, need to be part of this discussion and listened to very seriously because their concerns are legitimate and need to be put into action. I think one of the reasons why, there is such a binary kind of position of the way we look at education, charter schools versus public schools, standardized testing versus no standardized testing, is because a lot of education journalists don't have the context of where these issues lie. I mean, the issues around standardized testing and, for example, charter schools they're not new. I mean, these battles have been happening for decades. And if you want to take the issue of charter schools, for example, I am somebody who is a supporter of some charter schools, but I've critiqued the charter school movement altogether. And if you actually looked at the history of charter schools, the original purpose of charter schools was to create publicly funded schools that were going to be innovative and given flexibility in terms of their standards and curriculum and testing. And if you don't know that history, if you don't actually have looked at where the system was created, you can't understand why the movement has been designed the way it has structured, has been operating today. And I think charter schools is an excellent example, because you can't, I think oftentimes the media kind of paints it with a broad brush. I think there's a lot of major problems with charter schools, the corporatization of charter schools. I mean, for example, Success Academy and allegations of child abuse and other concerns. But there are charter schools, for example, like High Tech High in San Diego, a project-based learning innovative school that happens to just be a charter school. And so it is not a black and white kind of situation. It is much more nuanced, and the media oftentimes kind of pits one group against the other, when I think a lot of people who support public education, who support many of my ideas, would support charter schools if they actually were founded and wedded to the beliefs that we want to see for all schools altogether.